She thought it was just a stray Mustang, scarred, wild, and too stubborn to be caught. But when it showed up at dawn with a bloodied flank and eyes that wouldn't stop staring at the horizon, something in her gut told her to follow. That ride took her deeper into the mountain valley than she'd ever dared to go. What she found there didn't just change her luck, it rewrote everything she thought she knew about the land her father died trying to tame. Before we dive in, let us know where in the world you're watching, from ranch, city, or somewhere in between. And if stories about grit, mystery, and wild redemption speak to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might be even wilder than this one. The first time she saw the horse, it was just a flash of rust and muscle on the ridge behind the north pasture. Sunlight caught its mane like fire, and for a second, she thought she was imagining it. Wild Mustangs didn't come this close to people. Not anymore. Not since the fences went up and the land started drying out. But there it stood, still as stone, staring down at her like it knew something about her life she didn't. Ellie Markham had been up since before sunrise, fixing the busted irrigation line with mud still drying on her boots when the silence hit her. No birds, no wind, no creak of the old windmill, just the horse, and that silence, thick enough to choke on. She'd seen strays before, injured, starving, feral from running too long without trust, but this one was different. Built like it had been carved out of red rock, with a long scar down its right flank that looked too clean to be from a fight. Ellie squinted up at it, hands on her hips, heart ticking a little faster than it should. The horse didn't flinch, just turned, slow and deliberate, and walked back over the ridge like it had decided she wasn't ready yet. And maybe she wasn't. The rest of the day passed in a blur of repairs and sweat, but she couldn't stop thinking about the Mustang. It wasn't just the way it had appeared, it was the way it had looked at her. Like it had come for something. Like it was waiting for her to follow. She told herself it was just her imagination getting loud again. She'd been alone too long. Ever since the fire took the east barn and her brother left to drive trucks out in Colorado, the place had felt emptier by the month. The bills didn't wait. Neither did the winter. If something didn't give soon, she'd be forced to sell the last parcel of land her daddy swore he'd never part with, the same land the Mustang had stood watching from. That night, the storm rolled in late and fast. Thunder grumbled over the cliffs like an old dog too tired to bark. Ellie lit a single lantern in the kitchen, the rest of the cabin dark around her, and stared out the rain-streaked window. Just beyond the fence line, barely visible through the fogged-up glass, stood the horse again. Closer this time, rain running off its coat like oil. Eyes locked on the cabin, Ellie grabbed her slicker and stepped outside without thinking. The storm swallowed sound. The wind whipped her braid into her mouth. She took a single step forward, and the horse didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. Then, just as lightning cracked across the ridge, it turned and bolted not away from her, but toward the eastern trail no one used anymore. The one that disappeared behind the granite wall her family had always called the dead end. She hesitated only a second before following. The trail had nearly vanished under brush and moss. What was once a narrow mule path carved into the edge of the ridge had turned into a barely there memory, erased by wind, rain, and time. Ellie's boots slid more than they stepped, slick with mud from the storm. The horse was always just far enough ahead to be real but unreachable, a blur of muscle and fire disappearing behind curtains of mist. She didn't call out. Somehow, she knew it wouldn't answer. The eastern trail had always been treated like a family ghost. Her daddy called it bad luck, said there were bones buried under that dirt no map dared to mark. When Ellie was little, he told her stories about miners who got greedy and vanished without a trace, about surveyors who hiked in with bright eyes and never came back. She used to think it was just a way to scare her out of wandering too far. But now, wind screaming through the cliffs and branches clawing at her coat, she wasn't so sure. The trees changed first. Pines thinned out and turned gnarled, twisted like they'd been caught mid-scream. Then the rocks turned red, like something under the skin of the earth had been exposed. Ellie kept walking. Not because she wasn't scared she was, but because something deep in her chest told her this wasn't about fear. It was about truth. She didn't know how she knew, but she was sure of one thing. That horse wanted her to see something. She reached a clearing she didn't recognize, though it had to be just a few miles from her own fence line. A shallow valley opened up below, ringed by cliffs that didn't look like they belonged in Montana. Everything was too steep, too sudden. At the far edge sat a cabin. No, not a cabin. A shack. Barely standing, but alive with smoke curling from a chimney that shouldn't be working. The horse stood in front of it like a statue, rain slicking its back, eyes still locked on her. Ellie stopped at the ridge and stared down. Her breath fogged in front of her. The storm had passed, but the air felt heavier now. charged. She knew this place. Not from memory, but from dreams. Ones she'd been having since she was 13. Ones she used to wake from covered in sweat, certain her daddy had been buried in a place just like this. She blinked hard and shook her head, trying to push the thought away. She slid down the muddy slope, stumbling the last few feet before landing hard on her knees. The horse whinnied once and disappeared behind the shack. Ellie straightened, wiped the grit from her palms, and walked forward. The door to the shack was slightly ajar. The smell of smoke and something older, oil, maybe, or rust, hit her in the face. She reached for the handle, heart thudding in her ears. Someone had been here recently, and whoever it was might still be inside. The door creaked open slower than she expected, as if resisting her touch. Inside, the dim light from a lone oil lantern flickered against warped wooden walls. Everything smelled of damp earth and ash. A rusted stove in the corner exhaled slow ribbons of smoke through a crooked chimney pipe, but no firewood stacked nearby explained how it was still burning. Ellie stepped in slowly, letting the silence press against her chest. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. The shack looked abandoned at first glance, cobwebs in corners, dust layered on cracked jars and empty tins. But something was off. A tin coffee cup sat warm on the windowsill. A bedroll tucked into the corner slept in, and a trail of muddy footprints, fresh footprints, led from the threshold to the stove, then over to a worn saddlebag slumped beside an overturned crate. Whoever had been here had either left in a hurry, or hadn't left at all. Ellie crouched by the bag and hesitated, then opened the flap. Inside, she found things that didn't belong in a place this forgotten. A canteen still half full, a pen with a fresh ink cartridge, and a journal wrapped in oilcloth. She undid the tie and flipped it open, scanning pages filled with tight, slanted handwriting. The first name that leapt off the page stopped her breath cold. Walt Markham, her father. She sank onto the crate, hands trembling. He'd been dead for nearly 8 years, or at least that's what she'd been told. Disappeared during a solo cattle drive along the eastern ridge. No body, no answers. They found his horse shot in the canyon, and everyone assumed the rest. But now, here was his name, written a dozen times in careful notes, next to dates and names she didn't recognize. There was more. A map folded into the back of the journal, smudged and torn but marked with red ink. Circles, arrows, lines, leading to the very valley she was sitting in. Ellie traced one finger along a path labeled Spring Vein Runoff. Gold trace confirmed. Another marked claim marker pulled. Evidence burned. Left for her. She turned toward the stove again, realization dawning slow and sick in her gut. This shack wasn't just a refuge. It was a hiding place. Someone had been watching the valley, maybe even protecting it. And they'd known she'd come. The fire wasn't coincidence. It was a sign, a beacon, maybe even a test. Behind her, floorboards creaked. Ellie spun, journal clutched to her chest. But the doorway was empty, and the clearing outside lay quiet under the gray light. The Mustang was gone. And then she saw a second trail of fresh prints in the mud, not from the horse, from boots, leading behind the shack and up toward the rise that overlooked the northern slope. She wasn't alone, hadn't been since she stepped into the valley. Something was waiting, and whatever it was, knew exactly who she was. Ellie stepped out of the shack slowly, careful not to let the door slam behind her. The air outside was damp and hushed, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Her boots squelched in the mud as she followed the second trail of prints around the side of the shack, her pulse quickening with every step. She didn't call out, she didn't dare. Whoever had left those boot tracks had known she was coming. They'd built that fire, left the journal, marked the map. This wasn't random. She crested the small rise behind the shack and froze. Just ahead, resting against a rotting log, sat a rust-colored saddle Ellie hadn't seen in years, her father's old rig, the one he'd used for every long-haul trip. The leather was cracked but intact, and tucked beneath the strap on the cantle was a folded piece of paper sealed with a brass clip. She knelt beside it, heart pounding, and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. Her father's. If you're reading this, Elle, then you did what I never could, you followed the horse. She sat back hard on the ground, the words blurring for a moment as tears welled behind her eyes. She hadn't cried for her father in years, too busy surviving, too tired to feel. But now, here in the middle of nowhere, she felt like she was being handed pieces of him that no one else ever got to see. The note went on, I never stopped believing the land held something worth fighting for. But I couldn't protect it from the men who came after. They buried me, and made sure no one would follow the trail. Except maybe you. I hope it's you. You were always the one who knew how to listen when the rest of the world went quiet." Ellie's fingers trembled as she folded the letter again and tucked it carefully into her coat. She stared down at the saddlebag beside her. The journal was still clutched in her other hand. Inside were sketches of the valley water flows, mineral notations, even geological patterns, as if her father had been studying the land in secret. Page after page proved what she could barely believe. There was gold here. Not in the cartoon way people chased with pans and dreams, but real, consistent trace deposits feeding down from the western cliffs into a stream bed her father had labeled Spring Vein. She followed the map's markings down to the edge of the nearby stream, its waters running clear over polished stones. At first glance, it looked like any other runoff creek, but then she saw it a faint shimmer, just beneath the surface. Not a reflection. Something swirling. Tiny flakes glinting gold against the current. Her father had found something, and now, so had she. But just as the thrill rose in her throat, something else shifted in the air behind her. A twig snapped. Ellie turned sharply, and found a man standing at the top of the ridge, watching her like he'd been there the whole time. The man didn't move. He stood at the crest like he'd grown out of the ridge itself, tall, hat low over his brow, hands resting at his sides with a stillness that felt deliberate. Ellie's first instinct was to reach for the old hunting knife in her boot, but something about him made her pause. He didn't seem startled or aggressive. If anything, he looked like he'd been expecting her. The wind pushed back the edge of his coat, revealing a worn revolver holstered at his hip, not drawn, but ready. "You're late," he said, voice low and steady, like gravel and old regret. "He figured you'd come years ago." Ellie stood slowly, keeping her weight balanced. "You knew my father?" The man nodded once. "Walt was a good man. Too good, maybe. Thought he could outplay the folks who wanted this valley buried. He was wrong." She narrowed her eyes. "And you?" "I tried to warn him." Ellie didn't answer. Her eyes darted down the slope to the stream bed, then back to the stranger. He didn't follow her, gaze didn't need to. He already knew what she'd found. "I saw the journal," she said. "The maps, the deposit runs. This isn't just folklore. There's real value here. There's more than gold," the man replied. "But gold's enough to get people killed. It nearly got your father killed." She heard the choice of words. "Nearly?" The man looked away, toward the western wall of the valley. "I buried him myself, but not where they told you." Ellie's throat tightened. She wanted to demand the truth: who killed him, why no one told her, why he'd vanished without a body or a goodbye. But the man's face, worn and weathered, told her he wasn't here to argue. He was here because her father had asked him to be. "Name's Hale," he said finally. "I rode with Walt near the end. Helped him mark the springs. Helped him hide the rest." "The rest of what?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and began walking down the slope toward the stream. Ellie followed, keeping close, the knife in her boot still ready but forgotten for now. Hale knelt beside the water and reached into a crack between the rocks. When his hand emerged, he held a small glass vial, corked and still half full of black silt and golden flecks. "Assay tested this. 15 grams a pan. Clean. Natural. And enough veins in this valley to run a mine for a decade." Ellie stared. That much gold wasn't just a miracle, it was a war drum. Anyone who knew about it would come crawling out of the woodwork to take it, lie for it, kill for it. And if someone had killed her father to keep this valley buried, they'd come for her next. "So what now?" she asked. Hale looked up at her with something like sorrow. "Now you decide if you're gonna run, or if you're ready to finish what your father started." Ellie rode back into town the next morning, saddle sore and dirt-streaked, with Hale's words still grinding against her ribs. The secret was bigger than she'd thought, not just some rogue flex in a forgotten stream bed. This was a full-blown motherlode tucked inside a pocket of land so remote it had managed to stay hidden for decades, and somehow, someone had killed for it. Maybe more than once. But the part that twisted in her gut wasn't the gold. It was the name she'd seen on the old property ledger in Hale's shack. Walt Markham had never technically sold the land, not all of it. The title had been split before his death. The eastern quarter, the part with the valley, had quietly shifted hands 6 months after he vanished. And the buyer? A man named Reese Danner, a name Ellie hadn't heard in years but couldn't forget. He was a cattleman turned developer, smooth-talking and dangerous in the way rich men often are. Too many teeth in his smile, too many handshakes that led to court battles. He used to drop by the ranch when Ellie was a teenager, sniffing around like a coyote in Sunday boots. Her father never let him stay past dusk. Now, she was standing in front of the county clerk's office, heart hammering in her throat. She'd requested copies of every transaction tied to her family's land. The clerk, a woman named Donna who'd once taught Ellie how to square dance in the church hall, handed over the papers with a strange look. "Didn't know you were selling," she said. "I'm not," Ellie replied, already scanning the pages. Donna hesitated. "Well, you might want to take a look at this then." And there it was. Buried 2 pages deep, a purchase agreement dated just last week. A forged signature. Her name, written in a neat imitation, giving Rhys Danner full rights to the remaining quarter of her father's land. The document had already been notarized and filed. As far as the system was concerned, the valley was no longer hers. Ellie's jaw tightened. "Who filed this?" Donna leaned in close. "Guy in a press suit came in 3 days ago. Said you'd be by to verify the final deed. Guess he jumped the gun." Ellie stepped out of the office into the midday heat, the world suddenly louder than it had been a minute ago. Somewhere out there, Rhys Danner was already celebrating a theft he thought no one would notice. A man like that didn't file fake paperwork unless he was sure no one would fight back. She got back on her truck and headed for the edge of town, every turn of the tires burning hotter in her chest. This wasn't just about gold anymore. This was about legacy, about her father, about everything they'd buried when he disappeared. And someone with a pen and a lawyer was trying to steal it all, but they'd forgotten one thing. Ellie Markham wasn't afraid of men in suits. She found him at the edge of a construction site that hadn't broken ground yet. A white trailer sat crooked on the clay, its door open like a sneer. Around it stood survey flags, foundation markers, and a bulldozer already lined up for the first cut into the land. Her land. A few workers milled about, mostly young, mostly unaware. But at the center, leaning on a pickup truck that looked too polished for a place this dusty, stood Rhys Danner sipping from a thermos like he already owned the view. Ellie didn't announce herself. She parked her truck on the ridge and walked down with boots loud on the gravel. He spotted her halfway down and smiled, that snake oil grin from years ago. Still intact, still slick. Well, he said. "If it isn't little Ellie Markham, all grown up and walking tall." She didn't slow down. "You forged my name on a deed." He raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "Now that's an ugly word. I prefer expedited. The land was just sitting there, sweetheart. No activity, no filings, no sign of life. Legally speaking, it was abandoned. It's not abandoned. I've been paying taxes on it for 8 years. He shrugged. "Mistakes happen. County records can get fuzzy. You know how these small towns are. Besides, I already have plans drawn up. Eco-ranch properties, vacation retreats. We're going to make this place shine." "You mean you're going to gut it and sell it off to trust fund campers?" Rhys stepped closer, the smile slipping a little. "Look, I don't know what fantasy your daddy sold you, but there's nothing sacred about a patch of dirt. I made the right calls, greased the right wheels, and I'm giving you a chance to walk away with something instead of nothing. You think I care about money?" "No," he said, tone hardening. "But I think you care about being left with less than nothing. I own the valley now, and if you make trouble, I'll make sure the sheriff hears all about that little camp you've been squatting on. Illegal use, trespassing, maybe even mineral poaching." Ellie stared at him. The words hit like dry wind, empty, but abrasive. She remembered being 15, hiding behind her father's barn while Rhys drank coffee in their kitchen and offered help in exchange for control. Walt had thrown him off the ranch that day. Now he was back with papers instead of fists. "You always were a coward," she said quietly. Rhys's eyes flickered. "And you're still a dreamer. Just like your old man." The heat in her chest pulsed once, then cooled. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. "You're not stealing what he died for. Not again." She turned and walked away, leaving his threats hanging in the air. Back in the truck, her fingers curled tight around the steering wheel. This wasn't about saving land anymore. This was about telling the truth, about showing everyone who Rhys Danner really was. She wasn't going to file a complaint. She was going to dig up the past and bury him with it. The fire started just before dawn. Ellie had spent the night back in the shack, sleeping with one eye open, and the revolver Hale had loaned her within arm's reach. The valley had been too quiet, not peaceful watched. Even the wind felt like it was trying to whisper something she couldn't hear. When the scent hit her nostrils, smoke, thick and acrid, she was already moving. She burst out the door barefoot, hair wild, heart hammering. The slope above the creek was glowing orange, flames crawling through dry underbrush like fingers reaching for the cabin. Sparks leapt from a patch of oil-soaked logs she hadn't seen stacked the day before. It wasn't random. Someone had set this. Someone who knew she was inside. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing the pail from the corner and running to the stream, She threw water over the outer wall again and again, steam rising like ghosts. The fire was deliberate, but clumsy, meant to scare, not consume. Still, the message was clear. You're trespassing on something someone else wants to own. By the time the flames died, Hale had returned. He didn't ask questions, just stood there, jaw clenched, eyes scanning the perimeter like he was replaying a war he'd never stopped fighting. They know, he finally said. They tried to burn me out. They won't stop with fire. He was right. The next attack came in water. Late that afternoon, she and Hale climbed higher into the ridge to check the old runoff channels her father had marked years ago. What they found made Ellie's stomach drop. Someone had blocked the upper spring. A dam of rocks and tar paper redirected the water down a trench cut clean through the slope, away from the valley, away from the gold-bearing streams. If she hadn't found it in time, the land would have dried out within a week. The veins would have been buried again, lost under sediment. Whoever it was, they weren't just trying to scare her. They were trying to erase the evidence, to salt the earth so no one else could claim what they couldn't legally own. But when she and Hale returned to the shack that evening, they weren't alone. A truck sat idling at the bottom of the hill, matte black, unmarked. The man standing next to it wore a deputy's badge and a look that said he wasn't interested in paperwork. "I've had a complaint," he said, eyes sliding from Hale to Ellie. "Word is you're squatting on someone else's land, interfering with lawful development." Ellie didn't blink. "My name's on the original deed. You're welcome to look it up at the county office or ask Donna. She'll tell you who's lying." The deputy took a step closer, hand casually resting near his belt. "Just saying, things get messy out here. Roads wash out. Folks go missing." Hale moved then, slow but deliberate. He stepped between them and said, clear as day, "You make one more threat toward her, and you'll find out what missing feels like." The deputy didn't speak again, just got in his truck and drove away without another word. But the war had started, and Ellie wasn't backing down. The next morning, the Mustang returned. It stood in the same place it had the first time she saw it, up on the ridge, haloed in the amber light of sunrise, watching like it always had. Ellie stepped out of the shack, bruised and smoke-stained, with a rifle strapped across her back and a heart that had hardened overnight. She hadn't slept. Hale had kept watch, and they'd taken turns reinforcing the shack, digging out the stream bed and moving the saddlebag, the map, and her father's journal into a safer spot behind a rock outcropping only her father had known about. But now the Mustang was back, and for the first time, Ellie felt like she understood why. She climbed the ridge slowly, hands brushing against tall grass and wild sage, until she stood 10 feet from the animal. Its coat shimmered like burnished copper, that long scar still visible along its flank. Not just a survivor, a relic. She remembered the stories her father used to tell, sitting by the stove with mud on his boots and whiskey in his cup. Tales of a line of wild horses, bred for endurance and intelligence, long before fences carved up the land. One stallion in particular, red as rust, with eyes that looked through you. This had to be its descendant. Maybe the last. "You knew him, didn't you?" she whispered. "You followed him when no one else would." The horse flicked its ear, then turned its head toward the west slope, not toward danger this time, but toward possibility, toward escape, toward the part of the valley her father had circled on the map with a single note written in the margin. "If she finds this, she'll understand." Ellie followed. The western cliff looked sheer from a distance, but there was a hidden trail carved behind a cluster of boulders. Narrow, dangerous, and clearly unused for years. The Mustang led the way, sure-footed and calm. At the top, the world opened up. A bowl-shaped valley stretched below, perfectly shielded from view by the surrounding cliffs. Lush grass swayed in the breeze. A small lake glittered like a coin tossed into a wishing well. And across the ridge, veins of quartz and gold shimmered in the exposed rock face, untouched, unmined, and buried in silence. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The true claim. The one her father had found. The one he'd died protecting. She slid down into the valley and knelt by the rocks. In the soil beneath her fingers, something had been placed. A horseshoe. Rusted, broken and carved with a single word. Return. She looked back at the Mustang, now grazing peacefully a few yards away. The truth settled over her like dusk. This horse wasn't just wild. It was the last thread connecting her to a legacy buried beneath lies and time. And now, with the valley revealed, that legacy belonged to her. But the world wouldn't let it stay untouched for long. The valley didn't stay secret. Word got out faster than Ellie expected, not from her, but from the land itself. The fire, The blocked stream, the deputy's visit, it was all noise that drew attention. By the end of the week, rumors were spreading in town. Whispers in the diner, long looks at the feed store, strangers in clean boots asking about old mine claims. And Rhys Danner? He went quiet, which, for a man like him, was louder than a threat. But Ellie had moved fast. With Hale's help, she took her father's journal, the assay vials, and the forged deed straight to a state land office 3 counties over. There, she found a sympathetic clerk who didn't owe Rhys Danner favors, only the law. It took 2 long days and the help of a retired mineral rights attorney who'd once owed Hale a favor, but the original title was restored. Not just restored, reinforced. The Western Pocket, the one hidden behind the cliffs, was now officially tied to Ellie's name. She wasn't rich yet, not by a long shot, but she had something more dangerous than gold in her hands: proof. And in a world built on contracts and greed, proof was power. By the time Rhys called her, it was already too late. "Let's be reasonable," he said, voice smooth as bourbon gone sour. "We can still split this. Work together. No need to make this ugly." Ellie smiled into the receiver. "You already made it ugly." Then she hung up. That night, she sat by the stream, watching it run clean and fast over the stones. The Mustang grazed nearby, ears twitching, always alert. Hale leaned against a tree, sharpening an old blade that had probably seen more battles than she'd lived through. For once, there was peace. She ran her hands along the pages of her father's journal. There were still questions. What had really happened to him in those last days? How much had he known about Rhys's plans? About the valley? About her? But there was no grief anymore, only gratitude. She had what he tried to build. She had the land, the story, the truth, and she had the wild to thank for it. Later, she walked to the top of the ridge and looked down on the shack, the stream, the valley that had nearly been erased. It wasn't just valuable, it was hers, and she would never sell it. Not all of it. Not to men like Rhys. Maybe someday she'd build something here. Maybe a school, a sanctuary, a place for girls like her born with calloused hands and too much heart to come and find their own piece of wild. But for now, the valley would stay as it was. Untouched. Sacred. The Mustang lifted its head and met her gaze again. No fear, no begging, just recognition. Ellie tipped her hat. "I see you," she whispered. "I remember." And behind her, the wind carried the softest sound, not a voice, not a word, but something older, something like promise.